children's book about grief should have been one of the gentlest parts of this story. It was written for three boys who had lost their father, a book meant to help them understand absence, to give shape to pain, to offer the kind of comfort children search for when someone they love is suddenly gone. For a while, that was the story people believed they were seeing. A mother trying to help her sons heal, a widow speaking openly about loss, a family tragedy transformed into a message of hope. But that public image hid a very different reality, because the woman presenting herself as a grieving wife would eventually become the center of a murder trial. The book was supposed to help her children survive the loss of their father, but the courtroom forced a much harder question. What if the person guiding them through that loss was the reason it existed? The book was only the public version of the story. To understand how everything fell apart, you have to go back before the book, before the investigation, and before the public saw her as a grieving widow. Kouri and Eric Richins lived in Summit County, Utah, with their three sons. From the outside, their life had the shape of something stable: a marriage, children, a home, businesses, plans for the future. Eric was known as a businessman, a father, and a successful figure in the masonry world. He helped build a stone masonry business and was described by those close to him as hardworking, active, and deeply involved with his sons. Kouri worked in real estate and house flipping. She was trying to build something bigger through property deals, renovations, and investment projects. They were raising a young family while pursuing ambitious business goals. To anyone looking in from the outside, nothing about the Richins family suggested the beginning of a murder case. But behind that image, prosecutors would later argue the pressure was building. Eric and Kouri were not just a married couple trying to manage ordinary stress. Their lives were tied to property, debt, business decisions, and questions of control. And in the years before Eric's death, those issues began to matter more and more. Kouri's real estate work became one of the central parts of the case. In court, prosecutors pointed to Kouri Richins Realty, the house flipping business she started in 2019. The business was built around buying homes, renovating them, and trying to sell them for profit. On paper, that kind of work can look glamorous. Big homes, big deals, big returns. But house flipping also carries risk. Money has to move before profit comes in. Loans pile up. Timelines stretch. Renovation costs rise. A deal that looks promising can quickly become a financial trap. According to trial testimony from forensic accountant Brooke Carrington, Kouri's real estate operation expanded rapidly in the years before Eric died. More projects, more money, more debt. Prosecutors later argued that this was not just business pressure. It was financial collapse moving toward a breaking point. One of the major issues involved the Richins family home in Francis, Utah. Testimony showed that some of Kouri's business funding came through a home equity line of credit tied to that home. Prosecutors alleged that Kouri took out a $250,000 HELOC using Eric's power of attorney without his knowledge. That detail mattered because the home was not just a house, it was a family asset. If the money could not be repaid, the home itself was at risk. Eric's brother-in-law, Clint Benson, testified that he discovered the line of credit in property records and told Eric about it. According to that testimony, Eric was upset. The discovery reportedly led to discussions about divorce attorneys and legal protection. Eric never filed for divorce. Instead, he began taking steps to protect his property and his children. According to court filings and testimony, Eric worked with an estate planning attorney to create a trust. The trust was designed to protect assets for his three sons, and his sister, Kouri Richins Benson, was named as trustee. That decision would later become extremely important, because if Eric died, Kouri would not simply control everything he left behind. His sister would be responsible for managing the trust. And according to a statement from estate attorney Crystal Bowman Carter, Eric wanted protection from what he believed was misuse of his finances, and he wanted to make sure Kouri would not manage his property after his death. At the time, none of this was public. There were no national headlines, no televised trial, no public debate over evidence. Just a marriage quietly strained by financial pressure, property disputes, and legal decisions. But prosecutors would later argue that these were not background details. They were the foundation. They showed a relationship where money and control had become deeply entangled. Eric had assets. Kouri had growing business pressure. Eric had taken steps that limited what she could access if something happened to him. And according to the state, that created a motive. The defense saw the case very differently. Kouri's attorneys argued that the prosecution built a story around suspicion and financial stress without proving how Eric was killed. They pointed to rough patches in the marriage, but also argued that conflict did not equal murder. They pushed back against the idea that financial problems alone could explain what happened. That distinction matters because, at this point in the story, these were competing interpretations, not proven conclusions. Financial pressure was only one part of what prosecutors believed was unfolding. Still, there were warning signs that people close to Eric would later say they could not ignore. In the weeks before his death, Eric reportedly became concerned that something was wrong. Prosecutors would later point to a Valentine's Day incident when Eric became seriously ill after eating a sandwich Kouri had given him. According to the prosecution, Eric believed he may have been poisoned and told at least one person that he thought his wife had tried to poison him. The defense disputed that interpretation, arguing it could have been an allergic reaction. But for Eric's family and friends, those concerns would take on a different meaning after his death. Because before Kouri Richins ever became the subject of a murder trial, people close to him would later say he had already begun to fear that the greatest danger was not outside his home. It was inside it. By the time the case reached court, the night of Kouri Richins' death would be examined minute by minute. But in the early hours of March 4th, 2022, it did not begin as a national headline. It began as an emergency call from inside a family home in Jafs, Utah. According to court documents and statements later described in trial, Kouri Richins told investigators that she and Eric had been celebrating a real estate closing. She said she made him a Moscow Mule, a cocktail usually served with vodka, ginger beer, and lime. She said she brought the drink to him before bed. That detail would later become one of the most important parts of the entire case. At the time, it was simply part of Kouri's account of how the evening had unfolded. She said Eric went to sleep in the couple's bedroom. She said she went to sleep in one of their son's rooms because the child was having nightmares. Then, sometime later, she said she returned to the bedroom and found Eric unresponsive. At 3:21 in the morning, Kouri called 911. On that call, she reported that her husband was cold and not breathing. First responders were sent to the home. Summit County Sheriff's deputies and emergency medical personnel arrived around 3:31 a.m. Inside the home, they found Kouri Richins in the bedroom. He was 39 years old, a husband, a father of 3, a businessman who, only hours earlier, had still been alive inside the same house where his children were sleeping. For first responders, the immediate task was not to solve a murder. It was to respond to a death scene. They had to assess Eric, speak with the person who called for help, and begin documenting what had happened. That distinction matters, because one of the easiest mistakes in telling this case is to act as if everyone instantly knew what the story would become. That is not how the case unfolded. There was no public verdict that morning, no courtroom timeline, no national audience studying every detail. There was only a sudden death inside a home, a widow speaking to authorities, and questions that did not yet have answers. Kouri's account placed the drink near the center of the night. Prosecutors would later argue that the Moscow Mule was how Eric consumed the fentanyl that killed him. The defense would challenge the state's conclusions and argue that prosecutors could not prove exactly how the fentanyl entered his system. But none of that was settled in the first hours. At the beginning, investigators had to work with what was visible, what was reported, and what would later come back through medical testing. Eric's death did not immediately become the full criminal case people know today. The deeper turn came through toxicology. Toxicology is not instant. It can take weeks for results to return. And in a case like this, those results can completely change the meaning of a death. When Eric's toxicology results came back, fentanyl became central. An autopsy determined that Eric died from fentanyl intoxication. Court records later described the level in his blood as approximately 5 times the lethal dosage. The medical examiner also determined that the fentanyl was illicit, not medical grade. That finding moved the case into a different category. Eric was not known by his family as someone with a history of illicit drug use. The defense would later suggest other possibilities and challenge the state's version of how the fentanyl got into his body. But prosecutors argued that the amount, the circumstances, and the surrounding evidence pointed away from an accident. Where did the fentanyl come from? How did Eric ingest it? Who had access to him that night? Why would a man with so much to live for die suddenly in his own bedroom? Those questions became even heavier because of what had already been building before March 4th. The financial pressure, the property disputes, the estate planning, the concerns Eric had reportedly shared with people close to him. But on the night itself, none of that had yet been assembled into the case prosecutors would later bring. At first, it was a husband found dead at home. Then it became a toxicology report. Then it became a question no one could ignore. It was no longer only how Eric died. It was how fentanyl got into his system. Stories like this take weeks of research, court records, and fact-checking to put together. If you appreciate that effort, clicking the like and subscribe button is a small way to help keep this kind of work going and the growth of this channel. The toxicology report raised a question that could not be answered by grief alone. Kouri Richins had died at home. Fentanyl was in his system, and for his family, the explanation did not sit right. They knew what Eric had reportedly told people before his death. They knew about the financial tension. They knew about the trust. And after he was gone, they watched the fight over property and control begin almost immediately. Eric's family could not prosecute anyone. They could not file murder charges. They could not decide what a jury would eventually hear. But they could ask questions. And they refused to stop asking them. Before his death, Eric had created a trust that placed his sister, Kouri Richins Benson, in charge of his assets if he died. According to court filings and testimony, that trust was meant to protect his property and provide for his 3 sons. It also meant Kouri would not simply take control of everything. After Eric died, that became a major point of conflict. There were disputes over the family home, Eric's business interests, and what Kouri was entitled to receive. The estate and trust issues moved into civil court, where Eric's family challenged her access to parts of his property and financial legacy. Although the estate dispute unfolded in civil court, it became one of the places where deeper questions began to surface. Eric's sister, acting as trustee, and the other members of the family began looking closely at records, financial documents, money movement, and the circumstances surrounding Eric's death. They were not treating his death as simply a family tragedy followed by legal paperwork. They were trying to understand whether the paperwork itself helped explain what had happened before he died. That search eventually led them to private investigator Todd Gabler. Gabler was hired by Eric's family after Eric's death. In trial testimony, he explained that his work began in connection with the family's civil litigation over property issues. He was not law enforcement, and he did not work for the sheriff's office. His role was separate. But what he found did not stay separate forever. According to reporting from the trial, Gabler conducted interviews, reviewed records, examined phone and digital information available through the family's business and financial connections, and prepared material that was eventually shared with authorities. A sheriff's deputy later testified that information from Gabler played a significant role in advancing the official investigation. The criminal investigation still belonged to law enforcement and prosecutors, but the family's independent work became an important source of information as investigators continued building the case. As the investigation moved forward, the focus widened. It was no longer only about a husband found dead in bed, or a toxicology report, or a cocktail served before sleep. It became about everything that had surrounded Eric before that night. The money, the financial records, the property, the trust, and the people who had something to gain or lose. For prosecutors, those pieces would later help form the structure of the case. For the defense, they became part of a very different argument. Kouri's attorneys maintained that the investigation had been heavily influenced by Eric's family, shaped by suspicion, and too willing to view Kouri as guilty before all the evidence had been fairly considered. That conflict would eventually play out in court. But long before a jury ever heard the evidence, Eric's family kept pushing. They searched records. They challenged financial documents. They hired a private investigator. They refused to accept that Eric's death was simply a tragedy without explanation. And while the public saw a widow speaking about grief, Eric's family was following a very different trail, one they believed would eventually lead to the truth. While Eric's family was pushing for answers, Kouri Richins was building a very different public image. In March 2023, about a year after Eric's death, she self-published a children's book called Are You With Me? The book was presented as a tool for children dealing with the loss of a loved one. Its message, as publicly described, was about helping young minds understand that someone they had lost could still feel present in their lives. For a mother of 3 boys who had lost their father, that idea sounded understandable. On the surface, it fit the story people believed they were seeing: a widow trying to make sense of grief, a mother trying to comfort her children, a painful family loss transformed into something that could help others. That was the image many people came to know as Kouri promoted the book through local media. In April 2023, she appeared on Good Things Utah, a local television program, where she spoke about grief, children, and the challenge of helping her sons cope with the loss of their father. But behind the scenes, the case was moving in another direction. By the time Kouri was promoting Are You With Me?, Eric's death had already raised serious questions. His family had concerns. The toxicology report had changed the meaning of the night he died. Financial and estate issues were being examined, and investigators were following evidence that did not match the soft public image surrounding the book. That contrast is what made the book one of the defining images of the case. Writing a grief book was never the issue. Prosecutors would later argue that the woman presenting herself as a grieving mother had been responsible for creating the very loss she was publicly helping her children process. And once the case reached trial, the book was no longer just a public project. It became part of the larger story prosecutors told about image, control, and concealment. The book quickly became the image most people associated with the case. Long before many people learned about the trust, the estate dispute, the alleged financial pressure, or the private investigator, they knew about the children's book. It became the symbol that drew public attention to the story. But the book was never the evidence. It did not replace toxicology, witness testimony, financial records, phone data, or the investigation that had been unfolding behind the scenes. Its significance was symbolic. It highlighted the growing gap between Kouri's public image and the allegations prosecutors would later present in court. One thing you'll notice across many of the cases we cover is that dangerous relationships rarely look dangerous from the outside. The warning signs usually only become obvious in hindsight. That's exactly why I created the Hidden Red Flags Guide and Safety Clarity Toolkit, a practical resource that breaks down the recurring patterns of control, manipulation, financial abuse, and other warning signs that appear across real relationship-centered true crime cases. If you'd like to explore those patterns further, you'll find it linked below. Less than 2 months after the book was published, the public story collapsed. On May 8, 2023, Kouri Richins was arrested. The woman who had recently appeared as a grieving author was now facing criminal charges tied to her husband's death. The shift was jarring. The same interviews that had once looked like a mother speaking about healing now looked completely different under the weight of the accusations. The book never became the center of the criminal case. The evidence did, but it became the image people remembered. Before the arrest, many people saw Kouri Richins as a grieving mother helping her children through unimaginable loss. After the arrest, they looked back at those same interviews through a completely different lens. The public story had changed. The woman many people knew as a grieving author was now at the center of a case that prosecutors believed they could prove at trial. By the time the case reached trial, very few of the individual facts were new. The jury was not being asked to discover the story for the first time. They were being asked to decide whether all of the pieces, medical evidence, financial records, witness testimony, digital evidence, and the events leading up to Eric Richins' death formed one convincing picture. Prosecutors argued they did. The defense argued they did not. The state's case began with the medical evidence. Prosecutors argued that Eric died from a fatal dose of illicit fentanyl and maintained that it had been delivered in the Moscow Mule Kouri said she prepared for him before bed. From there, they returned to the Valentine's Day incident, arguing it showed Eric's death was not an isolated act, but the culmination of an earlier failed poisoning attempt. The defense rejected that interpretation, maintaining the illness could have been an allergic reaction rather than evidence of attempted murder. Prosecutors also revisited motive. They argued that mounting business debt, insurance issues, and Eric's estate gave Kouri a powerful financial incentive. According to the state, Eric's death offered a solution to problems that divorce would not. That argument was reinforced by testimony from Robert Josh Grossman, Kouri's former boyfriend. Grossman testified that the two had been involved in a years-long affair and that jurors were shown text messages exchanged in the weeks before Eric's death. In one message, Kouri wrote, "If he could just go away and you could just be here, life would be so perfect." In another, she asked Grossman whether he would marry her if she were already divorced. Prosecutors argued the messages revealed both the state of the relationship and Kouri's desire for a future without Eric. Grossman also described an unusual conversation they shared while parked in the Winter Mountains. He testified that Kouri suddenly asked him, "Have you ever killed anybody?" At the time, he assumed the question related to his military service in Iraq. Looking back after Eric's death, prosecutors argued the conversation carried a far different significance. Another key witness was former housekeeper Carmen Lauber. Lauber testified that Kouri had asked her to obtain drugs before Eric's death and that she ultimately supplied fentanyl. Prosecutors used her testimony to establish a possible connection between Kouri and the substance later found in Eric's body. The defense attacked Lauber's credibility, pointing to her criminal history, drug use, immunity agreement, and changing statements, arguing the prosecution relied too heavily on a witness with strong reasons to protect herself. Prosecutors also relied heavily on digital evidence. Jurors were shown phone records, deleted messages, and internet searches that prosecutors argued revealed planning before Eric's death and concern about the investigation afterward. Among the searches presented at trial were questions about lethal fentanyl dosage, poisoning, whether life insurance would still pay if a death certificate was marked as pending, and how to remotely wipe an iPhone or recover deleted text messages after investigators seized her phone. Prosecutors also pointed to searches involving prison and other topics they argued reflected consciousness of guilt. The defense disputed those interpretations, arguing that internet searches alone could not prove murder and that prosecutors were asking the jury to draw conclusions that went beyond the evidence. No single piece of evidence decided the case. It was the combination, medical findings, an alleged earlier poisoning attempt, financial motive, the affair and private messages, insurance and forgery evidence, witness testimony, digital records. According to prosecutors, each piece reinforced the others until they formed one consistent story. Eric's death, they argued, was not an accident, but a deliberate act driven by financial pressure and personal gain. The defense saw the same evidence differently. Kouri's attorneys argued that prosecutors had built a theory rather than proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They challenged the Valentine's Day allegation, questioned the financial motive, attacked the credibility of Carmen Lauber, disputed the meaning of the text messages and internet searches, and argued investigators never proved exactly how the fentanyl entered Eric's system or fully explored other possibilities. Their position never changed. Suspicion was not proof. Then came one of the trial's most notable moments. After the prosecution rested, the defense chose not to call a single witness. Kouri Richins did not testify. Her attorneys relied on cross-examination and argued that the state's evidence left too many unanswered questions. That decision did not imply guilt. A defendant has no obligation to testify or prove innocence. The burden of proof remained entirely with the prosecution. The case was now in the jury's hands. On March 16, 2026, after roughly 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Kouri Richins was found guilty on all 5 charges. The jury convicted her of aggravated murder in Eric Richins' death, attempted aggravated murder for the Valentine's Day poisoning attempt, 2 counts of insurance fraud, and forgery. At that moment, the language of the case changed. She was no longer only accused, she was convicted. 2 months later, on May 13, 2026, what would have been Eric Richins' 44th birthday, Kouri returned to court for sentencing. Prosecutors sought life without the possibility of parole. The defense argued for a sentence that would leave open the possibility of parole. The judge sentenced Kouri Richins to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She also received consecutive sentences for attempted aggravated murder, insurance fraud, and forgery. During the hearing, the emotional cost of the case came into full view. Reporting described statements from Eric's children saying they would not feel safe if their mother were ever released. Members of Eric's family also spoke about the lasting impact of his death in the years that followed. After weeks of testimony, months of investigation, and years of unanswered questions, the jury accepted the prosecution's version of events. Kouri Richins was guilty. The criminal case had reached its legal conclusion, but for Eric's family, the verdict answered only one question. It could never undo what had already been lost. In the end, the Kouri Richins case is not disturbing only because of how Eric Richins died. It is disturbing because of what happened around his death. A husband was found dead in his own home. 3 children lost their father. A family was left trying to understand how a life that seemed active, present, and full of responsibility could be gone in a single night. Then came the public image. A widow speaking about grief. A mother presenting herself as a guide through loss. A children's book built around the pain of losing a parent. To anyone watching from the outside, that version of the story had a certain shape. It looked like tragedy. It looked like healing. It looked like hope after unimaginable loss. But this case showed how dangerous appearances can be when they are accepted too quickly. Eric's family refused to accept the simplest explanation. They kept asking questions until the evidence could be tested where it mattered most, in court. And when that evidence was tested, the public image fell apart. The book remained. The interviews remained. The words about grief remained. But they no longer meant what they once seemed to mean. For Eric's children, this case left a loss that no public performance could soften. They lost their father. Then they had to live with the truth that their mother was convicted of causing that loss. That is the part of the story that should not be buried beneath headlines, courtroom drama, or the shock value of the book. At the center of this case was Eric Richins, a father, a son, a brother, a friend, a man whose life became the subject of arguments, exhibits, testimony, and verdict forms after he was no longer alive to speak for himself. The courtroom reached its conclusion. Kouri Richins was convicted. She was sentenced. The legal case gave an answer. But for the people who loved Eric, the sentence could not restore what was taken. It could only confirm that the public story was never the whole truth. Let us know what you think about this case in the comments. And if you want more true crime documentaries built on verified facts, subscribe.